Most people think caffeine gives them energy. It doesn't. And I don't mean that as a technicality. What caffeine actually does to your brain is something completely different. And once you understand the real mechanism, you will never think about your morning cup the same way again. In the next 20 minutes, I'm going to walk you through the actual biology of coffee. Not the stuff you've half heard before, but the real mechanism behind why you crash. Why your brewing method chemically transforms what's in your cup. Why decaf coffee still protects your liver, and exactly when you should and shouldn't be drinking it. This is one of the most studied substances in human history. The evidence is genuinely interesting. Let's get into it. The story starts with a molecule called adenosine. Every hour you are awake, adenosine accumulates steadily in your brain. It binds to specific receptors, and the more it binds, the stronger the signal becomes. Slow down. Rest. Sleep. Adenosine is your brain's biological fatigue meter, a measurable molecular countdown towards sleep. Caffeine's structure is remarkably similar to adenosine's, similar enough that when caffeine enters your bloodstream and crosses the blood-brain barrier, it competes for the exact same receptor sites. It doesn't activate them, it simply occupies them, blocking adenosine from binding. The fatigue signal can't get through. Your brain, in essence, can't read the meter. This is a critical distinction. Caffeine doesn't generate energy. It doesn't boost ATP production or accelerate metabolism in any meaningful short-term way. Its dominant effect is blocking the brain's fatigue signal. When those receptors are occupied, the downstream effect is real. The brain's excitatory systems, dopamine, norepinephrine, operate with less inhibition. You feel sharper, more alert, faster, but the adenosine hasn't disappeared. It's still accumulating behind the chemical roadblock. This is exactly why the caffeine crash exists. Once your liver metabolizes and clears the caffeine, those receptors become available again, and all that accumulated adenosine can now bind. As caffeine levels decline, the sleep pressure you've been deferring becomes perceptible again. For some people, that return feels gradual. For others, depending on how much adenosine built up and how fast their caffeine cleared, it can feel abrupt. And here's where individual biology matters significantly. The speed at which your liver clears caffeine is largely determined by a gene called CYP1A2. Fast metabolizers can process a cup in as little as 3 to 4 hours. Slow metabolizers may still have half of that caffeine circulating 7, 8, even 10 hours later. This is why the same double espresso that gives one person a clean 2-hour focus window sends another person into heart-pounding anxiety for the rest of the afternoon. Neither is wrong. They're operating different genetic hardware. Keep that in mind because it's going to matter a lot when we get to timing. Here's the thing, caffeine gets almost all the attention. That's a problem because it represents only a fraction of what you're actually consuming. A single coffee bean contains over 1,000 distinct chemical compounds. Roasting destroys some, creates new ones, transforms others. What ends up in your cup is a genuinely complex biological solution. Let me walk you through the ones that actually matter. The most important non-caffeine compounds in coffee are the chlorogenic acids, a family of polyphenols that act primarily on glucose metabolism. Here's what they do mechanistically. They inhibit an enzyme in the liver called glucose 6-phosphatase, which is responsible for releasing stored glucose into your bloodstream after meals. They also activate signaling pathways that improve insulin sensitivity in muscle and fat tissue. The result, your blood sugar rises more slowly after eating and stabilizes faster. Why does this matter? Because it explains something that confuses a lot of people. Decaffeinated coffee still shows protective effects in population studies. The metabolic benefits of coffee aren't coming from caffeine. They're coming from chlorogenic acids. Decaf has them too. We'll come back to this in a minute when we talk about diabetes. Now, here's something that most people have never heard of, and I think it's one of the most practically useful pieces of information in this entire video. Coffee beans naturally contain oils. Inside those oils are two compounds called caffeine and caffeine. And caffeine specifically is one of the most potent dietary elevators of LDL cholesterol identified in food research. The mechanism is actually fascinating. Caffeine activates receptors in your intestine that suppress the liver's own bile acid synthesis pathway, which is the primary route through which your body clears LDL cholesterol. Less bile acid production means less cholesterol clearance and LDL accumulates. This effect is dose dependent. At scale, it's clinically meaningful. Now, here's the critical part. What determines your exposure to caffeine is almost entirely your brewing method. These lipids are physically carried in coffee oils. Paper filters trap oils efficiently. Paper filtered coffee contains very low levels of caffeine. But French press, Turkish coffee, and metal mesh filters allow the oils to pass directly into your cup. The same bean, brewed differently, delivers a fundamentally different biochemical profile. If you have elevated LDL or cardiovascular risk and you're drinking French press every morning, this matters, and the fix is simply switching to a paper filter. Trigonelline is a compound in green coffee that partially degrades during roasting. One of its breakdown products is niacin, vitamin B3. Darker roasts produce more of it. There's also preliminary evidence that trigonelline itself has neuroprotective effects, though the research is still early. Melanoidins form during roasting through the same chemistry that produces that characteristic brown color and aroma. In your digestive tract, melanoidins behave like soluble fiber. They resist absorption, travel to the large intestine, and serve as substrate for beneficial gut bacteria, part of why coffee positively affects the microbiome. Now let's talk about what the evidence actually shows, and I want to be specific here because this is one of the most researched dietary substances in history, and the data is actually more favorable than most people realize. If there's one organ where coffee's benefit is most consistently documented, it is the liver. The protective effect is observed across the full spectrum of liver health in healthy people, in those with elevated liver enzymes, in patients with non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, in those with chronic hepatitis. Across most of these groups, regular coffee consumption associates with slower progression of liver damage and lower rates of fibrosis development. Two parallel mechanisms are responsible. The first is anti-inflammatory. Chronic low-grade inflammation is the primary driver of progressive liver damage. It's years of sustained inflammatory signaling that allow healthy liver cells to gradually scar over. The polyphenols in coffee, particularly chlorogenic acids and melanoidins, suppress key inflammatory cytokines and reduce oxidative stress in hepatic tissue. Less inflammation, less structural damage accumulating over time. The second is lipid regulation. Coffee appears to modulate fat accumulation in liver cells directly, slowing the rate at which simple fatty liver progresses toward inflammatory damage and ultimately fibrosis. Coffee doesn't reverse existing liver damage, but the evidence suggests it meaningfully slows the rate at which damage becomes irreversible. Meta-analyses pooling data from over 1 million subjects consistently show an inverse relationship between coffee consumption and type 2 diabetes risk, roughly a 6% relative risk reduction per additional daily cup. And critically, this association holds for decaffeinated coffee, which points directly at chlorogenic acids as the primary driver, not caffeine. Better glucose clearance, lower postprandial spikes, reduce long-term insulin demand. One essential caveat: this benefit is entirely negated by added sugars and sweetened creamers. The glucose regulatory effect of polyphenols cannot outrun the glycemic load of a heavily sweetened drink. This benefit belongs specifically to low sugar or unsweetened coffee. For Parkinson's disease, the mechanism involves adenosine, A2A receptors in the basal ganglia, a part of the brain critical to motor control. When these receptors are chronically stimulated, they suppress dopaminergic neurotransmission. Caffeine's blockade of A2 A receptors preserves dopamine signaling integrity. Large epidemiological studies consistently show that caffeine consumption is a strong inverse predictor of Parkinson's risk. And this isn't just observational data. The A2A receptor pathway is real enough that in 2019, the FDA approved a drug called istradefylline, a selective A2A receptor antagonist, as an adjunctive therapy for Parkinson's patients experiencing motor complications. That drug approval validates the receptor mechanism directly. For Alzheimer's, the mechanism targets a different pathway, specifically the accumulation of amyloid beta plaques and tau protein tangles that define the disease's pathology. Multiple coffee compounds, including caffeine and polyphenol antioxidants, appear to interfere with abnormal protein aggregation and support neuroprotective pathways. The observational evidence for Alzheimer's is less uniform than for Parkinson's. Some studies suggest a protective association, while others find no clear effect. But the biological plausibility is solid and no credible data points in a harmful direction. In 1991, the International Agency for Research on Cancer classified coffee as possibly carcinogenic to humans, specifically in relation to bladder cancer based on limited data available at the time. In 2016, after reviewing over 1,000 studies in humans and animals, IARC reclassified coffee to Group 3, not classifiable as to its carcinogenicity. That's not the same as proven safe. It means the weight of evidence no longer supports a carcinogenic classification. And for liver and uterine endometrial cancers, the data actually shows a protective association. The protection coffee appears to confer against liver, colorectal, and endometrial cancers operates through 3 parallel pathways: suppression of chronic inflammation, which is a recognized driver of malignant transformation, modulation of detoxification, enzymes that neutralize carcinogens, and regulation of gene expression patterns governing abnormal cell proliferation. These are biologically coherent mechanisms, consistent with the epidemiological data. Okay, so the evidence on coffee is largely favorable, but there are real ways to undermine all of that, and most people are doing at least one of them without realizing it. Let me walk through 3. Problem 1, you're drinking it too late. Caffeine's half-life in most adults averages 5 to 6 hours. But that range extends meaningfully, from around 3 hours in fast metabolizers to 10 or more in slow ones. A cup consumed at 3 p.m. means that by 9 p.m., bedtime for most people, somewhere between 25% and 50% of that caffeine is still actively blocking adenosine receptors. You may fall asleep, but caffeine in circulation doesn't just affect sleep onset, it compresses your sleep architecture, specifically reducing time in slow wave sleep. That's the deepest, most physically restorative phase. You get the hours, but not the quality. The consequences cascade forward. Poor deep sleep elevates morning cortisol, increases appetite for calorie-dense foods, impairs next day glucose metabolism, and compromises immune function. Because you wake feeling unrestored, the solution most people reach for is more caffeine. The cycle reinforces itself. Practical rule: hard caffeine, cut off at 2 p.m. if your sleep window begins around 10 to 11 p.m. If you're a slow metabolizer, you regularly experience jitteriness, elevated heart rate, or lying awake after moderate intake, move that cutoff to late morning. Problem 2, you're drinking it first thing on an empty stomach. This creates 3 overlapping biological problems. The first is direct gastric irritation. Caffeine stimulates acid secretion while simultaneously suppressing the stomach's own protective mucus lining. Elevated acid, reduced mucosal defense, no food buffer. Over months and years, this can contribute to gastritis or exacerbate reflux conditions. The second is cortisol interference, and this one is underappreciated. In the first 30 to 60 minutes after waking, cortisol naturally surges as part of what's called the cortisol awakening response. It's a conserved biological mechanism that mobilizes energy and alertness for the start of the day. Introducing caffeine during this peak doesn't enhance wakefulness. It overstimulates an already elevated system. Over time, the brain progressively downregulates its own natural arousal mechanisms in response to repeated pharmacological input. This is one of the mechanistic bases of caffeine tolerance. Some researchers suggest delaying your first cup 60 to 90 minutes after waking to allow the natural cortisol peak to complete before caffeine augments alertness. The logic is physiologically sound, though direct clinical trial evidence for this specific window remains limited. It's a low-cost experiment worth trying individually. The third issue, caffeine triggers a mild adrenaline response, notably amplified on an empty stomach, that produces a temporary reduction in insulin sensitivity. In healthy individuals, this resolved within a few hours. In those with type 2 diabetes or prediabetes, it can measurably affect glucose control through the rest of the morning. Problem 3. You're brewing in a way that changes the biochemistry. We already covered this in the cafe stall section, but it's worth repeating as an actionable point. If you have cardiovascular risk or elevated LDL, French press and Turkish style coffee present the highest cafe stall exposure. Switching to a paper filter is one of the single most impactful changes you can make. Same bean, completely different cardiovascular profile. A few groups where the standard advice changes. Pregnancy, the hard limit. This is the one context where the recommendation is not about optimization, it's a clinical limit. Caffeine crosses the placenta freely. The fetal liver lacks the enzyme adults use to metabolize caffeine. Where caffeine has a half-life of 5 to 6 hours in the adult bloodstream, in the fetal compartment it accumulates without efficient clearance. Beyond direct fetal exposure, caffeine may affect placental blood flow through vascular and catecholamine-mediated pathways, potentially reducing nutrient and oxygen delivery to the developing fetus. High gestational caffeine intake consistently associates with increased risk of low birth weight, preterm delivery, and miscarriage. The clinical threshold established by most obstetric guidelines, a strict maximum of 200 milligrams total caffeine per day from all sources, coffee, tea, dark chocolate, energy drinks, and certain OTC medications. In the first trimester, many clinicians recommend pushing toward the lower end of that range or eliminating caffeine entirely. Discuss with your care provider. For breastfeeding mothers who choose to consume caffeine, time intake immediately after nursing to allow maximum clearance before the next feed. Bone density. Less scary than you've heard. Coffee does cause mild increases in urinary calcium excretion. The magnitude is small, easily offset by 1 to 2 tablespoons of milk, consistent with research showing no meaningful fracture risk association in people with adequate calcium intake. The situation changes for postmenopausal women with declining bone density and low calcium intake. In that specific population, habitual heavy coffee consumption across years may contribute incrementally to bone loss. The intervention isn't coffee cessation, it's ensuring adequate dietary calcium. The biology matters only insofar as it changes what you do. So let me give you something concrete. If you're a healthy adult, the evidence supports up to around 400 milligrams of caffeine per day, roughly 3 to 4 standard cups, though this varies considerably by bean, roast, and brew method. Don't drink it on an empty stomach. Consider waiting 60 to 90 minutes after waking before your first cup, and set a hard cutoff at 2 p.m. If you have type 2 diabetes or prediabetes, the key is simple. Avoid all sweetened coffee variants. Flavored lattes, canned coffee drinks, instant coffee with added sugars, these eliminate any metabolic benefit entirely. Plain filtered coffee is appropriate in moderate amounts. Monitor your postprandial glucose responses, especially in the morning, since caffeine can transiently reduce insulin sensitivity. If you have elevated LDL or cardiovascular risk, switch to paper-filtered brewing. That single change eliminates nearly all dietary cafeistol exposure. Espresso, while unfiltered, has shorter extraction contact time and lower lipid content per standard serving compared to French press. French press and Turkish-style coffee present the highest cafeistol exposure. If you have acid reflux or gastritis, cold brew is your best option during remission. Cold extraction reduces certain irritating compounds compared to hot brewed methods, even though overall pH values are broadly similar. Always drink it post-meal, never fasted, and stay below 100 to 150 milligrams caffeine per session. Coffee is a biologically active tool and one of the most extensively researched dietary substances in human history. The weight of that evidence is largely favorable, but it's conditional. The same habit that reduces liver fibrosis risk in one person can systematically degrade another person's sleep architecture, insulin response, or bone health. The biology is real. The individual variation is equally real. Understanding the mechanism, how caffeine actually works, what chlorogenic acids actually do, why your brewing method biochemically transforms your cup, puts you in a position to use this deliberately rather than reflexively. The best version of your coffee habit isn't about the premium bean or the elaborate technique. It's about the right amount, at the right time, through the right method, for your specific biology.